In that familiar parable of Jesus, it's important to note that we are not the ones who prune the branches. That's decidedly God's job, which I think was kind of a miss on Jesus' part, because I'm a great gardener. So there's a man named Will Campbell. Will Campbell was born in Liberty, Mississippi, down southern Mississippi in 1924. Will Campbell called himself a bootleg preacher. He belonged to East Fork Baptist Church, and he was ordained a preacher when he gave his first sermon at 17 years old. And he always said he was as comfortable with the moonshiners as he was with the church folks, called himself a bootleg preacher. Others, folks who knew Campbell and were around him, called him the most radical Christian that they had ever known. Will Campbell marched with Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Will Campbell was the only white person in the room when Dr. King started the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. A lot of folks called Will Campbell the most radical Christian they'd ever known. Will Campbell escorted black children into a newly desegregated school in Little Rock, Arkansas in 1957. And that was no merry parade, that was the real deal. Will Campbell said over and over again, he never stopped saying it until a stroke took his voice in 2011. He said over and over again, if you're going to love one person, you got to love them all. If you're going to love one person, you got to love them all. If you're going to love everybody, then you've got to love everybody. And that's the gospel. Jesus wasn't selective, and neither was Will Campbell. Not for a single second. Will Campbell attended the courtroom trial of a Klan member named Sam Bowers. It was the late 90s, and the Attorney General of Mississippi had been tracking down folks who committed awful, heinous, murderous crimes back decades ago and bringing them to justice in the late 90s. And this man named Sam Bowers was prosecuted indeed by the Attorney General of Mississippi for the murder of a black man named Vernon Dahmer. As I say, Campbell attended the trial, and make no mistake about it, he was there in full solidarity with the victim, Mr. Vernon, and his family. But Will Campbell also happened to know Bowers, the man on trial for the murder. They're both from South Mississippi. They're both from the same parts. And if you know anything about the Deep South, some of y'all from the Deep South, you happen to know just about everybody in a small town. And that's why Campbell knew him, because Campbell was the kind of guy who knew everybody. Side note, my old man was the same way. Knew everybody. Some of y'all are like that. When Stevens is here in the front row with his family, he's the kind of guy, Woody Snowden too, knows everybody. One day at the trial during a break, Campbell stood up in the crowd, and he looked toward the defense table. Now, as I say, Will Campbell was the kind of guy who knows everybody. So when he stood up, all eyes turned to him. Will Campbell was respected in those parts. He was well liked. Everybody knew him. When he stood up, all eyes turned toward him. But Will Campbell didn't look at everybody who were looking at him. Will Campbell started walking. Will Campbell was walking, y'all, across that courtroom. He walked straight over, you know where this is going, don't you? He walked straight over to that defense table where a woman, a family member of the defendant, the murderous defendant, sat there by herself. Can you kind of picture that? Sitting by yourself in a crowded room. Everyone knew this woman, too. She was viewed as a racist, just an awful, ugly, atrocious person. Everybody doing all they could to stay away from her, so the seats around her were empty. Will Campbell walked right up to her. Well, y'all know what he did, right? My man sat down right next to her. And buddy, that lit the room on fire. Oh, people started murmuring, sort of the gossip machine cranked itself up. People started saying to their neighbors, Will Campbell switched sides. He's finally showing his true colors, that sort of thing. Later on that day, after the proceedings had ended for the day, a reporter walked up to Will Campbell, and he asked him a question. He said, Will Campbell, what were you thinking? Going over there, sitting next to that woman. Going over to the defense table. What were you thinking, Will Campbell? And Campbell just said right back, huh? He said, well, I feel deep compassion for that man and for his family. And the reporter said, well, I've got a story now. Why in the world would you feel compassion for any man that brutal? And Will Campbell said, because he's a prisoner of the state. And Jesus admonished us to visit with prisoners, no questions asked. And the reporter said to Will Campbell, I'm afraid I do not understand. Why extend this man the courtesy unless you're some kind of darn old Christian or something? That's what he said. And Will Campbell said, well, Will Campbell's from South Mississippi. Will Campbell said, well, I guess I am some sort of darned old Christian. And you got to make note of this. Huh? Will Campbell didn't have an ounce of sympathy or solidarity with the actions of that man and the hate that fueled the murder. But he was some kind of darned old Christian. And so over and over again, Will Campbell said with his very life, I sat next to that woman for the same reason that I sit, stand, or walk with anyone at all. It's what Jesus has taught me to do. Now let's double down on this and be super clear. Campbell didn't approach the murderer and his people because he believed something about them. Amen? Campbell connected with them, walked across that room, connected with them, sat down next to that atrocious woman because he believed something about God. Is there a Christian in this room? He believed something about God, and this is what he believed. He believed that God's grace is for everyone, and that God's grace can heal all brokenness and span all gaps, or God's grace is a trifle, a waste, and nothing at all. And we ought to move on to something a little bit more productive. They got me preaching up here, Mary. I'll say that again. I'll try to control myself. God's grace, isn't it good? God's grace is for everyone, huh? And can heal all brokenness and span all gaps. Or, y'all, God's grace is a trifle, a waste, and nothing at all, and we ought to move on to something more productive. We ain't moving on, are we? Huh? We ain't moving on, are we? Because we know that God's grace is infinite and spans all gaps. We know that if we love one, we must love all. We know that if we love everybody, then by God, that means we love every body. Darned old Christians. Y'all, we're going to baptize here in just a minute, I promise. And when we do this baptismal liturgy, I want you to listen for the two most important lines in the baptismal service. The first most important line is you, little Harrison, you are marked as Christ's own forever. You belong to Jesus. All of you do. Everybody does. And no matter what happens, no matter whether you're with the defense or the prosecution, Jesus is coming for you. Jesus is coming for you, walking across the room, coming for you to sit down in the ditch with you. Because you're marked as Christ's own forever. That's the first most important line. Second most important line is, I will with God's help. Ain't no heroes in this room. That baby's adorable and will grow up to be everything that he could be and more, but he will never be a hero. There are no heroes in the Christian tradition. There are no heroes in this room. I did not tell you a story about Will Campbell because I think he's a hero. What I told you about Will Campbell is a story about someone through whom God worked. Amen? With God's help. A story about someone through whom God worked to tie the branches to each other and all to the vine. That's what we do. Tie the branches to each other and all to the vine. So we don't do anything on our own. I will with God's help. There's a former version of me that was one of those pull up your bootstraps, I did it all on my own kind of guys. Sorry. No, stop it. I didn't do anything on my own. Neither did you. I hope that doesn't hurt you. I hope you know that. I will with God's help. Will Campbell didn't walk over to that table under his own steam, did he? No. He followed Jesus over there. He walked over to that table with God's help. Because whatever we do for the cause of love, we can only do it with God's help. And you know what that is? That's darn good news. That ought to be a relief. You mean I don't have to carry the world around on my shoulders anymore? It's not up to me. I just follow Jesus. I will with God's help. I will with God's help. That's what I hope Harrison remembers for all of his days. Those two most important lines. You are marked as Christ's own forever. My English teacher wife is here. That's possessive tense, isn't it? Christ's own forever. And I will with God's help. You see, one of the daily tasks of the baptized is to just stay open. Just stay open to the connections that thread their way all through this life. Keep your eyes and your heart open. Listen for the melody of connection and the symphony of life. It is not our job to do the pruning. Stop that. We do not prune. We bear fruit when we seek out connections to all the other branches and all to the vine. Jesus said, love your enemies. Will Campbell said plainly, I walked over to that enemy of a woman because I figured that's exactly where Jesus would have sat. And so it seemed like just the place for me to sit. You see, the truth is this. We're all connected. Oh, I don't want to be connected to her. Well, you are. We're all connected, good and bad, young and dead, black and white, guilty and innocent. We are all connected. And it is not enough just to see the connections. We're almost done. I will baptize in just a second. It is not enough just to see the connections. Isn't that a neat thread of connection? Not enough. I wouldn't baptize this baby into something that just looked good. Isn't that sweet? Not enough. The work of the baptized, the work of Harrison Wright for all of his life will be to act on the connectedness with love. So here's the question. I'm going to ask you a question. Don't answer it out loud. Who do you need to go sit next to? I'm serious. Who do you need to stand up, walk across that darned old room, and go sit next to? Who is so different from you, so opposed to everything that you are, that it simply must be that Jesus is walking across the room to him right this second? And his only hope is that you'll follow. Huh? Who is that? Act. Act on it. Because y'all, here's the deal. If we're going to love everybody, then let's love everybody. You love one, you got to love them all. Amen.